Hey guys, welcome back to my next video on my YouTube channel. This one is going to be a little bit of a longer video. I'm going to combine 3 different products and I'm going to showcase the end result first so you can see what my goal is, and then I'm going to show you how to build it out step by step so that you can do it yourself. This is primarily going to focus on, because it gets very long, it's primarily going to focus on one goal, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. You know, I may as well just show you what I'm talking about, and then I'll talk about what it is I'm going to walk you through. So, let's just pull up my HaloPSA. I have a ticket: YouTube demo message tracking. We are experiencing technical difficulties and assistance. Please help us. This is a test ticket I'm going to create, and we're going to see what happens here. So this ticket's going out, and what you'll see is an email. Oops, email went to Rewst, my bad. The email goes out, new YouTube acknowledgement, YouTube demo message tracking, and then we should see what happens almost immediately is boom, message tracking statistics get added into the note of the email. You can see Rewst received the email, delivery status is successful. Let me change his email. Let me remove his email address and swap it back out to my Gmail account while I'm in here, because we don't need him getting all of the messages that we're about to send. I know he's on vacation, so sorry, Rewst. That's what happens when you have support in your system and they're doing things to test something that's broken. Alright, so we see the delivery status happened, and if he were to open it, we would get a opened notice. If he were to junk it, we would get a junk notice, and so on and so forth. And we can demonstrate that again. We saw how quickly that happened. I'm going to take him out and put in Mendy at mendyonline.com. And I'm going to do, this is a test email out, and we are going to send it. And we can see how fast it happens. Like, this is the email that's going to be sent. We're going to send it. We should see that email get sent almost immediately. So if I go view edit the action, we should see it's been sent already. And then within a few short seconds, we should see, boom, the delivery tracking status. Now, I'm going to go one step further and pull up my email here. And I'm going to open that email. And then within a few short seconds after that, we should see this change to show that it's been opened. So I don't know, wait, or we can talk for a second. So there's a couple things that's going on here, and this is what I mean. Like, I'm only going to show you the delivery status right now, and then on another video we'll get to the open status, and then from there you can basically work everything else out that you need. You can see here that it's now been marked opened because I opened it. First things first, how is it that I'm sending out emails in literally near real time? You can see it's sent immediately. A lot of people, when they have HaloPSA and they're sending emails out from HaloPSA, you're probably using Graph API from Microsoft 365. I'm using that too, but I'm doing that to receive email. I'm not doing that to send email. And therefore, I have the ability to leave this setting checked, which is a setting that support tells you not to do. If you scroll down to the bottom, you see allow the web application to handle sending of emails and allow the web application to handle the creation of acknowledgement emails. These are 2 settings that are used when you have SMTP being used. So if you go to outgoing email defaults, you have the option of doing configure default SMTP. If you're using the SMTP instead of Graph API, you don't have to hand the email off to the NH server application in order to send the email, and therefore it won't take 5 minutes for you to send messages. It will be almost instantly. Now, hold on a second. You're going to say, how come we see here that you're not using the default SMTP settings or anything like that? You're still using the mailbox settings. How are you using that? Well, Halo introduced this feature that allows you to split your incoming and outgoing on the same mailbox. So my incoming is Graph API, and my outgoing is actually SMTP instead of Graph API. And here I configure my Mailgun system, username, password, and stuff like that. So the reason I'm doing this is because Halo has a feature that's built in that allows you to send messages as your own display name instead of the name of the mailbox. Set display name to agent name for the outgoing emails. This only works for SMTP due to a limitation with the Microsoft 365 Graph API. Because of this, I'm using SMTP, and I'm using Mailgun because why not? It's a great product. And therefore, I have Mailgun already set up. And because I'm doing SMTP with Mailgun, I also then have these two settings enabled, and I'm able to send messages real time. And if you look here, and you go into the mailbox setup, and you come here, and if you Azure Mail Link right here, and you scroll down, you'll find that it says, let's see if we can find it in search. Nope. All right, let's go to the bottom. It's going to be here somewhere, right here. It tells you to uncheck this. To ensure that the Azure method is used, you'll need to pass the sending function to the server processing application, which is NHServer. To do this, go to configuration email and untick the below setting. Allow the web application to handle the sending of emails. So here's the caveat. If you have multiple messages, multiple mailboxes that are set up to send messages, and any one of them are using Graph API to send messages, then you cannot leave that setting on. It will not work. Or at least according to the article, it won't work. I don't know if they've changed that. So if you're using SMTP for all mailboxes, then by all means, you can go ahead and leave those settings on and you'll get real-time message sending. So that's how that's working. So that's just one piece of that. And if, as you notice, Rewst is out. He's on vacation, so hopefully this doesn't bother him. Rewst, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. You can hate me later. I'm going to move on. So now we get to the actual message tracking. Like, how is this happening exactly? If you remember that we are using Mailgun, so let me go ahead and log into Mailgun, and I'll show you what this looks like. Mailgun, as an SMTP server, allows for the ability to do certain things to the messages, like append tracking links, to modify links within the message so that it can track when a link is clicked. It can track delivery of the messages and so on and so forth. If we go to the domain, specifically that I'm doing right now, website.risingtidegroup.net, and then we go to the webhooks, you'll see that you have the ability to set up a webhook for all of these events that occur. And notice the webhook URL I'm doing is roost.io. So how exactly does this work? Well, I'm going to take you through this step by step. The first thing that you want to do is you want to set up your Halo to send out through Mailgun, and then Mailgun to set up the webhooks, and then we're using Roost. So let's go ahead and log into Roost, and let's take you through this workflow that I have. And if you notice, I have a HaloPSA Mailgun email tracking with one trigger. So if you've watched my other videos, you know that Roost is a fairly complex automation platform, and it can get a little confusing to use. A lot of the stuff is not needed. Like this entire branch here is disabled. We're going to eventually come back and use some of the stuff or delete it as it's not needed anymore. But everything else potentially does things. And if you notice, I only have delivered. I have everything else worked out, so that's the open events. And then I don't have anything for the clicked link, and I don't have anything for a permanent failure. I have to build those out as well. But let's start from the beginning. In this case, I have a Mailgun webhook, and you do this by adding a trigger, and you're setting the trigger type to core-webhook. And then you have the ability to specify things that you want for that webhook to behave, and you can turn it on. So I'm going to cancel this, and I'm going to show you the webhook that I actually have created. If you go to the edit trigger, you can see Mailgun-webhook. Here's the trigger type is core webhook. After you save it, you get this button. We'll show you the webhook URLs that you can use. And then integration overrides are per organization, which we're not going to use at this point. Allowed methods, it's posts, because that's what Mailgun is doing to us. It's posting the data. And then we're responding back to Mailgun, just sending a result to 100th message webhook delivered. By default, it doesn't do this. By default, it'll send the full information that it received. It'll send back. As like a confirmation, but we're not doing that. We're just going to replace that all with, hey, webhook was delivered, and we're good to go. We're responding 200 to our status. We're not waiting for results before we respond. We're going to respond immediately, and that's basically it. A lot of the stuff is default config out of the box, except for the change in the response, and even that, what was there previously would work. I just want to make it smaller in this case. So that's my actual trigger configured, and then what we do from there is we start building our workflow. If you recall my Roost 101 video, the first thing that we want to put on in general is a noop action. That's the very beginning of almost any workflow is a noop action. It's the action that tells, or the task that tells the workflow where to start from. The reason for this is because if you were to have something that were to like go back and forth and then you don't have a clear beginning, the workflow wouldn't know where to begin and it would just fail outright. So that's why you have a blank noop, no operation is what they call it, and it's under the core stuff, noop right here. And then you have a blank noop that does nothing, literally just telling it where to start. So one of the features that Roost recently released is the ability to favorite actions. That's what these stars are on the side, so that when you right click, they're right here and available for you. In this case, this workflow is already built out. So I'm just going to take you through the full workflow and what it is it's doing, that's happening. If you notice, and if you remember again from my videos, the parts underneath the task is called a transition. So if you notice here, I've got my task, which is the Mailgun start here. It does absolutely nothing. It just says, check event type from inbound Mailgun webhook. It's nothing. And I set my variables here. I have a transition that's called set variables, and I start building out my variables from the results of the webhook. So I have here looking at the results of the webhook that Mailgun sent to me, and you can see that under the view results. And then we can come here and say, look, we've got 9. So let's look at this one, and we can see that the input came in here. We've got a body, we've got event data, and so on and so forth. Here the event was opened. We've got a geolocation for where it was opened. We see the recipient that opened it. We see the message, which has a message ID inside of it. So we know that there's a whole bunch of events that we want to be tracking on, right? So if we look back here, we've got complained, we've got clicked, we've got delivered, opened, permanent fail, and unsubscribed. In this case, we started working on delivered first. But the thing that we wanted to figure out is we don't want to have to recreate all of the variables every time they get used. We also, we could make a typo, we could grab the wrong thing, it could be confusing. So we want to abstract in layers and say, what are the variables that will be available to be used? What is the data that we're getting in this post that's going to be available every single time for every event? And we don't know what that may be, but we start building it out from exploring. So we fired off an open event, we fired off a delivered event. Those are the two that we're focusing on first. And we see what we can do to abstract those variables. What are the common values between them? And we build them out in the very first step. We've got a message ID, we've got a recipient domain, we've got a recipient 2, which I called message 2. We have a type of event, whether it was open, delivered, unsubscribed, so on and so forth. And then we have an event item, which is literally this comes in later on. It's literally just a JSON object that tells you the type of event and who the recipient was. So these are all built from the existing, except for this one primarily. The rest are all built from the existing payload that we get that is not specific to an event. And then we come here and we see, look, check email history. So these are a little bit mislabeled because I never went back and fixed the names. Here we can see the description that was previously over here is actually the correct description for this. We check the event type from inbound Mailgun webhook. And again, this does nothing. It's a core no-op action. And the only thing it's doing is it's creating multiple conditions based off the event type that we previously set. Delivered, clicked, permanent fail, everything else. And this is just capturing everything else. Now, when we get everything else, we have a ticket ID that we have to find. And we'll come to this in a moment. You can see I'm grabbing some org bars, and we've got an action ID. Again, we're going to come to that later on, probably in the next video, actually. Right, we're looking for right now is the delivered action. This is the one we want to copy. So the deliver action looks a little bit like this. Let me go back here and find the results workflow so that we can see. It's probably one of these. Let's see. Yep, here we have it delivered. This is the one to Rewst. But you can see what this looks like. So we've got a message, and instead of just a message ID within the headers, we actually have a subject line. And the subject line, of course, includes the ticket ID. So what we need to do is we need to find the ticket that actually sent this email. We need to somehow bring this email back to the ticket, and then we need to find the action that sent the email, and then we want to update that action, right? That's the overall view. If we look here, we can see the tables being added into the existing action that I sent out. And if we go and inspect that action, view edit action, we can see the email hasn't changed at all. Like, we're not changing the HTML of the email. We're going to action details, and we're adding it to the note part within Halo. So we're modifying the action that was used to send an email, and we're appending the table to it that includes this message tracking statistics. So let's go look at how we're doing this. Or go to delivered. we track the ticket ID, and if we explore this Jinja, we notice we're grabbing the body.eventData.message.headers.subject, which is literally where we are right here, subject, and then we're taking that and we're splitting it off of open bracket RTG ID colon. And if we notice, if we have right here open bracket RTG ID colon, we split off that, we're going to have two parts of the remaining string. We'll have the first part where it has the title of the company, the status, and the ticket name, and then we will have a ticket ID with a closing square bracket. So we grab the second half of the array that we just created by doing that split, and then we replace the closing bracket with nothing, leaving us with just the ticket number. And that is our ticket ID. The next thing that we want to do is we want to grab all recipients. So any person who is included in the message to header right here is going to be different from the people who were included in the recipient. The to header from the message is always going to have everyone who was on that email, minus their CC people. But if you have multiple people in the to field, it's going to show up as multiple people, comma separated within this field. So we want to take everyone from that field and add it into a recipient's array of sorts. And then we also want to add in the recipient itself, assuming the recipient's different. So that's how we add this in. First we grab the recipients, we split it up into an array. And we're doing this using a Jinja comprehension list within Roost because we need to be able to trim the email because it gets passed through as a string, comma separated string. So we split on the comma and then we trim this extra spaces around it. We throw it into the recipient's variable, and then we check to see if the recipient, if the message to exists inside that new array that we just created. If it doesn't, we do if not, then we actually append the message to into the same array. We end the if statement, and then we output recipients, which is the new variable, which gets saved inside of all recipients as a data alias. That was a lot. And that's just the beginning. We're just getting started, guys. This is why we are not doing the entire workflow today. We're going to do just the delivery side, and we'll come back for the rest later on, assuming you guys want it. So let's go. The next step here is we have the ticket ID. Now we need to grab the actions that have been performed against that ticket. You have to keep in mind that what's happening here is we don't have a real state. We have no way to connect the message to the action that was performed. We have a ticket number in the subject line on a deliver state, but we don't have an action ID. We don't know which action it was. We don't know what's going on. The only thing that we can say with certainty is that there is a high probability of the last action that had been performed that was email conversational is likely to be the action that's related to the email going out because everything's happening in real time. This would not work if you're using Microsoft Graph and your emails were delayed 5 minutes because then it doesn't, like you could have 3 or 4 actions within a 5-minute period. You don't know what else could happen. But this is almost instant, and therefore the likelihood of you grabbing the wrong action has been decreased. It's still not 100% foolproof, but it has been decreased. So what we're doing is we're grabbing the actions from that ticket, we're grabbing agent-only actions, and we're grabbing conversation-only actions, okay? We're not excluding system actions because we still want to include the acknowledgement email that goes out. But this will exclude end users responding back in. This would exclude non-email actions, and it's something that wasn't part of the conversation. So we're going to try to narrow the scope as much as possible, and there could be a time where you still get back too much, or you don't get anything at all, or something didn't fit in which case you can create an additional transition here that says if actions are 0, then go ahead and run it again with less restrictions on this stuff to try to find a matching action. But as of right now, because I'm using Mailgun, because I have real-time message delivery, because the Mailgun webhook fires so fast, therefore by the time this action in Roost is running, the likelihood of there being different actions in play is very low at this point. So we're grabbing that last action, and you can see this because what I have is I'm grabbing all actions for that ticket ID. Like I said, we're grabbing agent only, conversation only, and we're not including the HTML email, but we are including the HTML note. Okay, that becomes important. And then everything else is blank or default. In the transition, we're actually creating an action data alias, and we're going to pull the results of that task we just did, and we're grabbing the very first action within that array. So in the HaloPSA API, when you grab a list of actions, it comes back as an object that tells you a record count, how many records were found, and then also gives you an actions key that has an array of actions inside of it. We're grabbing the very first one, which is the last one in, first one out. So if someone does an action on a ticket, it becomes array 0 as the very first action. If someone else does something on a ticket, then that second action becomes array 0, and the very first one becomes array 1, and so on and so forth. So therefore, we're grabbing the very last action that had been performed by selecting the very first one in the array, and we're saving it as action. Okay. The next thing that we do is a little bit tricky. We're going to skip this right now. We're going to skip the next two, and we're going to go down here. These two will become clear as to why we're doing it once we move forward. So the only thing to note that I'm going to talk about right now is that I split off here when we're doing delivery versus everything else. In this case, we're doing delivered events only, so we're going to follow this path and keep going down this way. Okay. After we come to here, what we do is we build a new organizational variable. Now, organization variables are ways to store data inside of Roost. It's not like an officially recommended way of storing a large amount of data, but it is a way of storing like values to be reused fairly easily. There are some caveats to it. So let's just look at this, what I'm doing at this point. I'm building an initial org var, but notice it again, it's just a no op at this point. So that means I have stuff happening in the transition. In the transition, I've got two new data aliases, temp org var and new org var. My temp org var looks like this. It contains a JSON object. The JSON object will have the message ID, the ticket ID, the recipients that we built out. It's going to have the CTX event underscore ID. Remember that was the event that we built out from the beginning. And in fact, it's actually an array. If you notice, I have the square brackets around it. I'm building out an array of event items. So this is going to contain the event item that's being done. And then I'm grabbing the action ID it happened to, and I'm grabbing a timestamp. Okay? And I'm outputting this as a JSON object. Now I'm taking that, and I'm going to go to my new org var, and I do something pretty complicated here. In this case, I'm checking to see if my org var called Mailgun tracking list actually exists. If it doesn't exist, I'm going to output a default value of a blank array. And then I'm going to parse that JSON. So it's just a string right now. I'm going to parse it into a JSON object, and I'm going to check the length of it. If it's 0, then I'm skipping all of this, and I'm just outputting my previous variable, which is the brand new built details about this action and what happened. And I'm going to output just that within an array. So that's going to be the very first item within this organization variable that exists from this run. If it already exists, so let's say if it's greater than 0, then we do a bunch of complicated stuff here. What we're going to do first is we're going to grab the current org variable, and we're going to parse the JSON, and then we're going to grab the new event, which is done based off the temp org var events first, and then we're going to grab the object based off of the variable. We're going to see if that message ID already exists in that variable. So again, we're doing list comprehension here. It goes from here to here. And we're going to say item for item. That means it's going to output the item itself. The full object is going to be expressed for every item that's inside the org list, which is the org list we just did from the variable, if the message ID equals the message ID from the temp org var, which basically means if my message already exists here, then set that object, because we don't want to overwrite it. We don't want to lose anything. We're trying to create this artificial state tracking so that we can tell when A, there's more than one user on the email, or B, if that email had already been processed before or something like that. So we're going to grab it and set the object. If there's an object and the new event, which is from here, is not already inside of that object, then append it. Now, if we're going to append it, and then we're going to output that object. Now, if it already is in that object, we're not going to re-add the new event multiple times. We don't want to create a mess. We don't want to have, like multiple table rows being created for the same email address, saying that the email's been delivered 3 times. So we're just going to skip it if it's already there, and we're just going to output the object itself. Or If the object was not even found, that's what this else does up here. So if this came back with nothing, then we're going to append the entire org var that we created into the org list and then output the org list itself. Okay, so it's a lot. If you do want this full JSON or the full Jinja, hit me up and I'll send it to you. But this is basically what it's doing. It's basically checking the organization variable, confirming that the email is not already there. If it is, it's appending the event to it if the event is brand new. If it's not brand new, it's just outputting what it already has. And then the next thing it's doing is it's setting the organization variable to what we just built, setting it as a JSON string. So it's stringifying that entire JSON, so it can be going into the org var, and it's setting the org var to the value of what we just built from here. Okay. The last and final thing that we're doing is we're going to go to the action, and we're going to throw out using the action.outcome, which came from this action, using the action ticket ID, came from this action again. We're going to throw out in the action ID itself, we're going to update the action notes by saying, hey, put the note back in there, split it based off this line that says Jinja replace here, grab the beginning of that note. So again, if you remember from before when we did the ticket number in the subject line, when you do a split, it creates an array. And there's two sides to the array. There's the sides before the split and the sides after the split. What I'm doing, my end goal, is I'm appending data to the ticket note inside of Halo. Now, I need to be able to update that note that I'm appending, so I need a way to make sure I can find it again the next time I run the workflow. So what I did is I created, when I appended, I also appended an HTML comment that says Jinja replace here. When I split, on the next run, based off this string, I end up with two parts. The first part, which is 0, is the original ticket notes that happened. And the second part, which is 1, is always going to be anything I modified, my table I built, or anything else I can put in there. I have an HR, which is a new line. I have a horizontal line across. I've got a BR, which is a new line. So I'm finding everything there just by splitting off of this text I already have in here. And what I'm really doing is I'm throwing it all away, and I'm rebuilding the table every single time using this Jinja templated HTML. And you can see the HTML here. It's got table, style, border, collapse, so on and so forth. And then if you go down here, you notice I've got my message tracking statistics is the table head. Okay. Then I've got column heads. I've got delivery status. I've got open status, right? This is familiar. Email junked and recipient email. Now you can change these and add additional columns to whatever you want because there's always data you can put in these things. And then what we're doing is as follows. We're going to stop the HTML here, and we're moving to Jinja as of right here. And we're saying for every recipient that exists inside of message.recipients, right? And notice we set message up here. So before the HTML, we set the message to be message for message in CTX new org var if message.message_id equals CTX.message_ID. We're grabbing that first one. So similar to what we did with the organization variable when we tried finding the relevant organization variable based off message ID, we're going to do that again. We're going to grab the full organization variable with all the events, and we're going to set it as message inside of this Jinja run. And then down here, we're going to say for every recipient in message.recipients. Remember, recipients is going to be an array of people who receive that email. And now we're going to build out a column. I guess not really a column. The columns are above that. We're building out rows for every recipient that exists. So if there's one recipient, we're going to have one row. If there's two recipients, we're going to have two rows, and so on and so forth. And then what we do is we populate that row based off a bunch of Jinja templated stuff. So if the word delivered is in event.type for event in message.events, remember message is the object we retrieved. Events is an array of events that occurred inside of that object. And we're going to, again, do list comprehension here to say, hey, if the type of event is a delivered event inside message.events, and if the recipient is the recipient that we're looping through, right? So we're going to grab if event.recipient equals recipient. So this list comprehension grabs from here to here the event types that exist within message.events where the recipient for that event is the recipient that we're looping through. All right, so that's why we have the type and recipient inside of events. So we're using that to key off. It's like our unique key. And then we're checking to see if the array that gets returned here, we'll get an array back of events that occurred for that recipient. We're checking to see if one of those events is delivered. If it is, we're going to include an ASCII character that indicates a checkbox, or a check mark, I should say. And sure enough, you see a check mark right here. That's the ASCII character. So that's how we're doing that. Now we're going to say, well, what if instead of it, and we're doing an else if here instead, because in this case the else if is either one or the other. It can't be both. So if there's a delivery failed instead of delivered in that event type, in that same exact event type, then throw a capital X inside of it. So we would see in the event of failure occurred, I'm going to close these two articles so they're not confusing. In the event of failure occurred to deliver, we would actually see an X instead of a check mark. And then if we keep going, we end the if statement completely. So from here to here, we have Jinja templating that's going to output text in the event of one of two conditions occur. Okay. Then we continue our table styling, and we do another column, and we say, hey, if for this column, if opened is in the events, then throw check mark and they're opened. And then we end if there, because there's only one type of potential result for open. It's either opened or it's not opened. And we're not going to say it failed to open, right? So we're not going to put an X there. It's just either going to be a check mark or it's going to be blank. And then we continue to the next cell, the next column there, and we do the same exact thing again. If complained, so if the event that fired is complained, an event type for event in message.events for that thing, for that recipient, or unsubscribed. We're capturing two. We're using an or statement here to capture either complained or unsubscribed, and it's going to be considered the same one. Then we're going to throw a big red bold dot. It's going to be a circle, and that's it. Again, it's going to be the same thing. You can't fail to complain. You either complained or you didn't. So it's either going to be blank or it's going to be a red dot, and we're going to end our if. At that point, we're going to throw the remaining style for our final column, and we're going to output the recipient. There's no condition here. The recipient's always going to be there. If it was, because we're looping through recipients, if they exist, they're going to be there. And then we end our for at this point, and then we follow up with the footer for the table that includes the email message tracking ID at that point. So we can always go back through logs and say, hey, this message tracking ID was found on this logs, and this is what happened. And we have like a full view of the email all the way through if something were to happen. And that's it. That's how I'm updating the note, and that is the loop that I'm doing. So let's go back and circle through some of these things here and talk about why we have some of those things that I skipped. If we go to the race condition handler and the refresh org delivery, what happens, again, the organization variables are not really meant to be used this way. And what happens is that when a workflow fires in Roost, the workflow loads up all of the variables into memory at that time, and then they never refresh again. So with that in mind, if you were to have multiple workflows running at a time, in the situation where that were to happen, then one of those workflows changed a variable, the second workflow would not know that that variable changed, and you'd end up clobbering each other. They could both be trying to access the organization variable looking for the same message ID, or looking for two different message IDs, or not even realizing the variable may not even exist yet. And then one workflow creates it, and then a second workflow also creates it. They won't have the same information, and you end up losing data. So what we do here is we refresh that org delivery, and we grab it as current org var, because then we are basically saying, forget what's loaded into memory, go grab the current value. Now, we haven't really solved the problem is what happens if two of them run at the same time. Yeah, we're grabbing the current value, but if they're both running simultaneously, that means they still have a problem, potentially. So we added a race condition handler. And the race condition handler literally generates a random number, and it delays for that number of seconds the workflow. So it's completely random. So even if two were to fire simultaneously, or 5 or 6 were to fire simultaneously, they'll all run on a delay. Now, we built this out on purpose so that the actions that need to happen occur first. We grab the HaloPSA list actions, we build out our stuff. It's only when we have to create the org var and we have to refresh the org var that we do it as close as possible to the beginning, so that the delay happens as quickly as possible. And the only action we do ahead of time is the list actions, because that's the only task we do ahead of time, is because the list actions, because that's what we need to have in order to build our variables out. Everything else happens after that, because we want the workflow to hit the random delay as quickly as possible so that you don't have this potential clobbering. And we want to keep the refresh, the delay, and the setting as close as possible as well, so that it all happens very quickly together and it doesn't cause them to clobber over each other. In my early testing of these, I found that if we sent an email to two people, they would both show up on the table, but only one of them would be marked delivered. After implementing these changes, we were able to see, and I'll test it for you right now, that if we were to email someone, and we'll email Mendy at mendyalign.com and mendygreen at gmail.com, if we were to email two people, and again, this will go back really quick, and we send this out, we will see, actually we can see it up here. If we go to the results, we'll see already workflows are running. And we come here and we'll find that, there we go, we've got both delivered because they're both running simultaneously, but they are delayed, so they're not clobbering over each other. And that is this workflow. If you want help setting it up, let me know. I basically walked you through step by step for the delivery side of things. The only thing regarding opening is that now that we have the action ID stored inside the organization variable, we can literally get it, action ID, from here. We grab that HaloPSA get action based off that action ID we just set, and the ticket ID that we have from, again, the organization variable. And then once we have that action, we can literally pipe it through the rest of the race condition handler, the refresh org delivery. We have everything else because there's two different actions we want to do here. The organization variable that we build out with the delivery is different than the organization variable we build out for when it's any other kind of action. Remember, the delivery, we have to build a full object out. We got to build out the message ID, we got to build out the recipients array, we have to build out the timestamp, the ticket ID, the action ID, so on and so forth. For every other follow-up event that occurs from Mailgun, we just have to log the additional events. So the org vars look very different. In this case, it's literally just the event type. At some point, we can replace this with the with the context variables that we have here. I think it's this one, the event item. We can replace, like, this is basically the event type. So we can just replace that with this. And then we're building a new org var. This looks similar, but it's a different logic, because in this case, we're not appending if the event already exists. So we're not going to append to the object that the event already exists, and we're not going to output a brand new object of just the event if if it doesn't exist at all. Like if the message ID couldn't be found, we're not going to create a new object for the environment variable, for the organization variable of just the event, because that makes no sense. We need to have all of those items inside of the object. So we're just going to drop it silently if it's not there. And then at this point, we can see here if we got a new org var created successfully. So if this did work and there's an output, then we're going to go ahead and hand this off to setting the organization variable. If we didn't, then we're just going to end it right here. At that point, the rest of the workflow takes over and we just update the ticket again. I did say I wasn't going to cover opening the email, but apparently I did it anyways. At this point, this should technically cover opens and others, but we would just have to continue building out the event types for like what it is that actually happens here and here. In this case, I think because permanent fail happens and because, you know, this right here already builds it based off the event type, then we probably could just have it go through and run. But because I haven't tested them yet, I don't want to run it and then break the workflow. So at some point I'm going to go through, I'm going to link this to here. I'm going to say run a link, and I'm going to update that link or click that link, and then we can see tracking of that link being clicked into the table. Other things that we can do that I'm debating doing is, because on an open, if we look here and go to an open event here, we see the event data opened, MND line. We have client info. It shows the client name, the client type, the user agent string. So we can create like a details column and just constantly, on every open, a new link fires. We can just constantly refresh that table with the latest client information each time. So that's something we can do potentially. We may end up doing, but there's a lot of things that you can consider. We're throwing the timestamp in the object because at some point you may want to do some sort of data cleanup. That object can get pretty big if you're very busy on emails. So again, we're throwing that in there so that we can do data retention, so on and so forth. There's a lot of things to consider. Some of the things I want to point out here when you're doing this with Roost is that anywhere we have two flows into a single action, so this race condition, for example, or this set org var, we have to adjust this criteria sensitivity. The criteria sensitivity is used, transition criteria sensitivity, it's used to determine when to run. Do I wait for all of my tasks to complete before I move forward, or do I just run if any one of my tasks complete? And you do that by setting this number. If it was 0, it would wait for all tasks. Otherwise, it would wait for the number of tasks you specify here. So if you had 3 things going here and you only needed any 2 of those 3, then you would set it to 2. In this case, I have 2 things going, so therefore I need any one of these 2. Therefore, I'm setting it to 1. And it's the same exact thing down here by setting the org bar. If you go to advanced, and you can see the same transition criteria sensitivity. The other thing that I would talk about is, if you notice the different colors of these arrows that exist up here, it's because I'm doing a follow first instead of a follow all. Under advanced, if you look at the transition mode, it's going to look for the very first one that matches a success. Otherwise, it will follow every successful transition it can. So we don't want that to happen. We only want it to follow the successful transition, the very first successful transition it hits. So we turn it to a follow first. And we do that here, we do that here. Anywhere that we potentially don't want it to run in all directions, we would go change it at that point. Anyways, that is it for my video of email tracking. You can see this worked. You can see the end result. You can see the workflow here. We did it using Mailgun. You can see why we need the real-time emails, which is why I covered that as well. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up, risingtidegroup.net, my website. The only last thing I'm going to say is that I did build this using 3 products from different platforms. Mailgun is my SMTP server, Rewst is my automation platform, and Halo using my ticketing system. I don't need to do this with just those platforms. There are alternatives that you can do for it that will give you close to or similar message tracking level skills. For example, I know like ConnectWise Manage, if you're in the cloud, you don't have the ability of choosing your mail server. So you can't necessarily do SMTP out over Mailgun. Autotask, you don't necessarily have that either. But you do have the ability of setting templates in those outbound emails. And you can pass in a Roost URL into those templates. And that Roost URL can include parameters like a ticket ID from a variable or something like that. And therefore, when that ticket fires, when that URL gets called, you have the ability potentially to go and update that ticket from the parameters you pass in the URL. I haven't explored any of this in production or even in lab is really what I say. Like in production, I'm using the message tracking just fine, but that I built. But in terms of using alternative methods of message tracking, I haven't actually explored yet in the lab. But maybe we'll see a video on how that would look if we were to build this out solely using just Roost and my email templates from HaloPSA, which should then be able to be repeated on almost any ticketing platform. Anyways, I hope you liked it. Comments below. Reach out if you want any help setting this up. And of course, if you have any requests on specific topics, let me know that as well. Thanks for watching.